Hey, CNFers, if you're looking to get into shape, someone to hold yourself accountable, you hire a personal trainer, right? I could use one if I'm being honest right now, looking down at this. Well, it doesn't matter. Likewise, if your writing needs a spotter, consider letting me help you out. If you're writing a book, an essay, a query, or book proposal, and you're ready to level up, email me at brendan@brendanomero.com, and we'll start a dialogue. I'd be honored to help you get where you want to go. Oh, and by the way, call for submissions for the next issue of the audio magazine titled Codes, themed codes, codes to live by, mantras, personal beliefs, rules, oppressive, liberating. I love people who are so principled, they live by a code. Captain Fantastic, even the Mandalorian. This is the way. Give me your best 2,000-word essays or fewer about codes. Email creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com with code in the subject line. Simultaneous submissions are fine, but if you have your piece accepted by another publication or are holding out for a more, quote, prestigious, unquote, publication, let me know ASAP so I don't read and edit your piece, because I even give notes to rejected essays. Wow, what a guy. Deadline is October 31st. This is the way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not entirely opposed to the idea that writing and the impulse to write is a kind of mental illness.
Well, this is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I speak to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Mara. What's up? Who's our guest today? Hank? Oh, well. Look who the cat dragged in. It's Brad Listi, he of the Otherppl podcast. You're a writer. You've heard of him. And you've heard of it, right? He's also the author of the new book, Autofiction Memoirs. Now, technically it's a novel, but who knows? No, but it's a novel. But it pulls directly from a lot of experience and personal experience from Brad. And it might be my favorite book of the year to date. At least on this day of the year. It is. Oh, shit. Be brief and tell them everything. It's published by IG Publishing. IG? I don't know. I don't know why I like certain things or don't like certain things. It's like a certain guitar chord. It's either in tune or it isn't. And this book was written in a voice that's very much in harmony with the way I wish I could write, but fail miserably. Be it my journalism or my essay writing or my podcast parting shots, hell, even my intros. Right from the first word, I was like, I know I'm in for a trip. And this book made me tear up in places, made me laugh in several more, and it was one of those rare books I couldn't wait to get back to after I set it down. And I only set it down on account of my paralyzing, untreated ADHD. Keep the conversation going on Twitter at CNFPod. Or Instagram at Creative Nonfiction Podcast. You can also support the show by becoming a paid member at patreon.com/CNFpod. As I say, the show is free, but it sure as hell ain't cheap. Members get transcripts, chances to ask questions of future guests, special pods. I give away cool shiz. If my book proposal lands a deal, yeah, you guessed it, I'll be sharing that so you can see what a winning proposal looks like. And if it doesn't sell, pie to the face. I totally get it that this thing being this podcast comes out for free every week, and it's hard to pay for. And it's hard to, even the idea of shelling out even a nominal amount of money per month for this thing that comes out. It's a hard thing to think about. But the Patreon page is my shameless Starbucks tip jar that you have to stare at and think about and be like, damn it, probably should give them a tip. But do I really want to? Oh, shit, fine, I will. Just this time, this one time, but it gets you every time. And then they do the competing tip jars, and you're like, well, shit, I got to vote one way or the other. Good news, at $2 a month, you're helping the production of the show and putting money in the pockets of writers for the audio magazine. That thing. Also, this episode, and for the next 8 or so, there'll be 8. Oh, I think we're up to 7 now. Hey, countdown. If you don't, there's a mid-roll ad. So if you don't want to hear an ad in the middle of the show, I'm dropping the file ad-free on the Patreon page. Wow. What another wickedly exciting perk. Free ways to support the show. Who doesn't like free? You can leave a kind review or rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Written reviews for our little podcast that could go a long way towards validating it for the wayward CNFer. And also, be sure you're heading over to BrendanO'Mara.com for show notes and to sign up for my up to 11 Rage Against the Algorithm CNFing monthly newsletter. First of the month, no spam. So far as I can tell, you cannot beat it. All right, so when I was editing this episode, I found myself nodding along to what Brad was saying throughout much of the edit. That doesn't really happen very much because I'm just like in the edit and I edit at a faster speed. So I'm just going through and clipping out a bunch of shit. And then I just found myself like, yeah, that's good. Oh, I like that. And that honestly should tell you all you need to know about how amazing this interview went. I also felt like I didn't have my fastball. But when I listened back to the edit, I was like, I wasn't that bad. So, I always wig out when I interview good interviewers, and Brad's one of the good ones. So, well, anyway, the name of the book is Be Brief and Tell Them Everything, and it's amazing. And I recommend you buy 2 copies at minimum. And take 2 copies and call me in the morning, okay? All right, here's Brad. I think what I really liked about it too, is that it was a short novel or memoir or hybrid or autofiction, whatever you want to call it. And I love books that are really short. I mean, Great Gatsby is 180 something pages, and it's like the greatest American novel. I think we get so hung up on having to write so much volume for it to be considered like a serious book, and I just loved how lean it was, and it was just I have to imagine that was on the forefront of your mind when you were composing it.
Yeah, I mean, that's like my favorite length of a book, or one of my favorite lengths. I mean, there aren't any rules when it comes to that sort of thing. If a book is great, it can be 600 pages.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, I always find myself deeply impressed by books that are around this length but feel weighty. So that's something I think I was trying to emulate. That's kind of the thing I was shooting for, and each individual reader can decide how well I did at achieving it. But I think that a lot of the times when I read books, I find myself feeling like the book could have been cut. And I say this a lot, but it's the truth. It's how I often feel. I think sometimes things aren't edited as much as they could be or whatever. And I tried very, very hard to make sure that there was no wasted motion.
Yeah, I think that's especially true given the little chunklets that it really compose the whole thing. And when you're composing a book of this nature, is that kind of how it comes out? Like you'll just write sometimes 100 or 200 word spurt and you're just kind of, or take a breather, or is it a bit more like this was the game plan all along, just short, like little chunklets?
No, I think it's a trial and error process. I spent a long time with this material, and I learned to locate which sections were working best for me. And then as I got toward the end of the process and into the final drafting phase, a lot of it becomes intuitive because you know the material so well. And I think if I had one major insight that guided me, it was to make sure that the narrative moved, not only because that's good for the reader. People get bored if you're lingering or lagging or whatever, but also because the narrative often is dealing with really difficult stuff.
Yeah.
And it can be done. I hesitate to make any like declarations because you wind up sounding like a fool. Like it can be done. You could write 600 pages on a really traumatic experience if you're good enough. But for me, like as a matter of preference and just the way that I'm wired, I wanted to try to work in a compressed mode and to keep things moving. That's not to say that I wanted to skimp on difficult parts. I do think that the book slows down enough, hopefully, in the places that are most delicate. I mean, I think that's actually the places where I slowed down the most.
Yeah.
In previous iterations, I had gone on too long. And it wasn't just length, it was repetition too. There were certain aspects of the book, like, so for example, Miscarriage, the couple in the book has suffered 5 miscarriages. In previous iterations of the book, I wrote all 5. And it took me a while to realize that, like, you really only need to spell one of these out, I think, unless they're dramatically different. But each one is different in its own way, I guess. But I think the mechanics at a basic level are pretty much the same. And I just don't think that readers need to see all 5. I think one's enough. It's hard enough to write, to read through one, and you get the idea. So those are the kinds of creative choices that I made in the interest of making the reading experience as pleasant as possible, but also trying to ensure a kind of velocity to the read that I always appreciate. I just don't want people to be bored or to feel like they're being harangued or to feel like I'm in love with the sound of my own voice.
Right, yeah.
And that I just can't stop just like making prose or whatever, like I don't want to be that. I don't want to be a blowhard if I can help it.
That makes me think of the sentiment behind a Kurt Vonnegut quote of just like being mindful of the reader's time too. It's
always,
right?
Always. Yeah. I mean, that's it. I mean, and I say that with conviction, but I also say that as a matter of a lot of failure. Like, this is something that I actually struggle with. I think there are a lot of writers out there who have a much more developed or natural sense of the reader's experience. And it takes me a while to get there, like to where I have that like sort of finely attuned sense of when my material is best serving the reader versus when it's serving some sort of emotional need of mine or, whatever it is. It's a blind spot creatively for me.
Yeah.
And, it's something I hope I'm getting stronger at. But even if I'm slow to the mark, it is something that I refuse to cut corners on. And it's one of the reasons why I think this book took me so long, is that I couldn't be satisfied with an end product until I felt like I had created an experience on the page that I felt was my best effort in that regard. And I've said this a lot, but I think when I finished this particular draft of the book, like, bears repeating that I knew I wouldn't have to write it again. I was satisfied with this draft, whether or not it found a publisher. I got it to a place where I felt comfortable with it, and I felt like I had delivered an experience that a certain kind of reader might enjoy. And I knew I couldn't take it any farther. I kind of realized that I had done as much with it as I could, and I had given it my best shot. And then fortunately, a publisher wanted to put it into print.
Yeah, it's because you wrote this over the course of 12 years. Is that right?
Something like that. It's been a long time. Yeah. I mean, it's weird because there's so many different iterations, and I'm not super meticulous about keeping a diary or, writing down. I don't have, like, all the word count totals that I keep are on like a pad with a pen. I don't have it formalized. So I'm not somebody who is like a very good archivist, I should say, of my own work. So how many drafts there were, how many different iterations, like, it gets to the point where I don't even know.
Yeah.
But suffice it to say, it was a long haul.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you. Like, I've had this one book that I started in 2009, and it's still kind of just, floating there in its own little holding pattern. And it's just one of those things where you come back to it, and I think I've shelved it for as long as 2 years at a time. And it just lets itself do its thing, and then it hangs out in the drawer and becomes something else. It's a wild thing. You talk about intuition a few moments ago. And, over the course of writing something over such a long period of time, at what point do you start to question your intuition about just the direction of the book, whether it's worthy or not? Should I finish this? And even if I finish it, can I be happy with it being done and it not finding a home, but I'm better by this book?
Yeah, I mean, I questioned my intuition up until the final draft. Yeah. I think I always had an uneasy relationship with the material until I got it into this form. And I wanted to quit. There were many times where I was like, you know what, this might just be too much. Like, I might not be able to wrangle this, or it's too emotionally sensitive, or I'm not far enough away from it, or all the different things that you kind of tell yourself. But what I found is that I could not quit. And this has been the case for me in every like creative endeavor, so many different things in my life, where once I get my teeth into something, I have a really hard time surrendering. Like I will maybe surrender temporarily, but then I'll go back to it. And, Steve Almond, who was recently on my podcast and who's a pal of mine, says something great. It's like we write the things that we can't get rid of by any other means. And that describes this book for me particularly well. It was a kind of clearing the decks, unavoidable. I mean, there's all these different ways that I've described it through the years. Unavoidable, monolithic, haunting. It's just this thing that was always there. And it felt absurd to try to write about anything else because this stuff obviously needed to be reckoned with for me. And then you get to the point where you can get into magical thinking or superstitious thinking where it's like, if I don't finish this, if I don't see this through, it's going to have bad consequences for me, or I'm going to die feeling bad about it, or, these kinds of things. And I'm not sure how much of an exaggeration there is in that. I really do feel like if I had not figured out a way to make this book, it probably would have bothered me until the end.
Right. Yeah. That's, I think a lot of people have a hard time writing a book, or you put so much effort into it. However you want to phrase it, you bleed on the page and all this stuff. And it's one of those things where it can be hard, like you said, to quit or to move on from something, or to accept that maybe this thing won't find the light of a publisher. It's one of those things where sometimes you have to just reframe it. I think Matt Bell talked about this too, when talking about his latest book, about, sometimes these books don't get published, but it's good practice nevertheless. And that can be hard to swallow when you spend so much time with it. And then sometimes you do just have to move on. But it can be really hard to do because you get so wedded. Like, it feels like a failure if it doesn't hit publication or if it's not published. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, another key point to make along these lines is the fact that I did quit on several versions of this novel. There were versions that were, markedly different, wildly different than what the book became in its final form. And I think through those failures, I sort of slowly had to admit to myself that I didn't know how to tell this story other than to sort of just tell it and to dig down into the truth of it. Even though the book is ultimately a novel, it's autofiction. I'm working pretty close to the bone. I fictionalize quite a bit, but I'm also working with like real events and people and my life and things that I've thought and felt and all the rest. And, I think those earlier failed iterations, were definitely good practice, and I definitely learned from them, but they ultimately weren't the book that I needed to write most deeply. And I don't know if I'm capable of writing any other kind of book. Like, there are times when I wish I maybe had like more of just a fun, entertaining relationship with fiction or with writing, where it's like, yeah, I'm just going to tell a fun story that's going to be fun for me. And, hopefully I can get there. That's something I actually would like to learn how to do. And I could imagine a scenario in the future where I've exhausted myself working in this inside out mode, which I quite like and which I get a lot from and which I love as a reader. So I'm not denigrating it. I'm just saying that, I'd like to maybe expand my range a little bit and try different things somewhere down the line.
Well, this book is also, it's wildly funny too, as dark as it is in several places. Like, there are several parts where it's just like, I can tell Brad's having a good time here. Like, there are just so many great just one-liners and turns of phrase that aren't jokey, but just are funny as they stem out of the story. So I think there is a component of, at least I felt you were having fun here, as you say that it might be hard to write for fun. It felt like you were having fun in moments during the writing of this book, at least through my interpretation of reading it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like the funny part has to be there for me in order to make books. Like, I just as a reader am so starved, and as a human being am so starved for humor. That's the way that I move through the world. I essentially have the sense of humor of a 12-year-old boy. Right. Like, I am I'm very permissive and sort of wide open and starving for jokes. And I think that at the same time, I'm clearly drawn to trying to see clearly the difficult things and to make sure that I don't look away and to really try to reckon with them. And I think with my book and with art and with just my worldview in general, I'm always aware of how, like humor and pathos interact and how dark and light need one another, and how you can have some of the biggest laughs of your life in some of the worst moments, and those kinds of juxtapositions are interesting to me. And then as just a matter of being, as we spoke about earlier, a good host to the reader, to really think about their experience and to try to make sure that you're making that primary rather than making primary the needs of your own ego or whatever it might be. And I just think that if you're telling a story that really deals in like difficult human experience, if you can find a way to work humor into it, it's kind of like the spoonful of sugar, that helps people along the way, and people appreciate it. And it's also, I think, and this might be the most fundamental issue for me, it's just most reflective of how life actually is to me as an experience. It's never just one way, it's dark and light, and often at the same time.
And I recently listened to your latest conversation with George Saunders, which took place a little while ago. But you guys got to talking about the idea of writing for yourself versus then making that conscious decision that you have to write for an audience eventually, and how challenging that was. And I'm kind of hearing you wrestle with that a bit too. At what point in your drafting processes do you start to then consider, okay, this is going to land on an end user, and I have to be mindful of that as the writer, and as we were saying earlier too, like honoring that time, because in there is having some being cognizant of the audience.
Yeah, it happened later than it should have, in my view anyway. Like, this is something, again, that I'm slow to realize, or I imagine that I'm slow to realize compared to other writers. But, these earlier drafts are just too self-involved, or just plain bad, or filled with too much ennui and not enough laughs. They don't move. It's all these different things that you wind up figuring out through failure and in the edit. But eventually I get there, I feel like I got there to the best of my ability. And again, it's something that I hope I'm going to improve on. It's something I'm going to be monitoring in myself on subsequent books. Let's put it that way.
Exactly. Well, I like that you bring up this notion of failure. It's through that constant iteration that eventually you get to something that is great. I go back to these I'm a Metallica junkie, just totally bleed Metallica. And so when they turn out their new records, oftentimes they have these behind the scenes videos of like how they're workshopping a song before it actually makes it onto the record. And you're listening to certain riffs and you're like, oh, that doesn't sound right. And then the vocals, you're like, oh, the way Hetfield's like inflected a certain lyric, it's like, that doesn't sound right. And then, but that is the iteration of, and the failure of the process of working through it until you get to something like, oh, that is it. So maybe you can speak to that and just the failure of those steps, the stumbling along until you hit the thing that is like, oh yeah, this is the thing. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think another comparison might be like comedians, like really good comedians going into a club to work on new material and just bombing, which is not something you see unless you're the audience in the club or you happen to catch clips of it in some documentary about comedy. But, that was something that was new to me until I think, what was it? It was like a Jerry Seinfeld documentary or something, or Chris Rock, or, and you're just like, wow, they're really bad.
Yeah.
You're not used to seeing this great comic be that bad and to bomb that hard in front of an audience. And same thing goes with a band, like you say, working out a song. And so, as much as I might bemoan the slowness of my process and how long it took me to get this book out, the reality is that failure is just a natural part of writing and making anything that's worth making. And one of the things I've caught myself wondering, especially in these conversations that I've been having about the book in the run up to publication, is maybe like, it's not that I fail more than other writers. Maybe just like I reacted to the failure poorly, or it took more out of me than it should have because I just wasn't recognizing that this is just the natural reality of it for everyone.
Yeah.
including the quote unquote greats, and so maybe I just need to get on with it and quit being so upset. Not that I don't know, not that I like rended garments too much, but it would take something out of me if I had been working on, say, an entire draft of a novel and then realized it sucked. It's hard not to be like, well, I'm going to take a break, but maybe the really good writers don't take that break. They just get up the next morning and they're like, okay, starting over. Now I learned what didn't work. And they have this great attitude about it,
Yeah, I think Isaac Asimov had a practice where he basically just sat at his keyboard from like 6 a.m. till noon and typed. And that's all he did. Like, he wasn't concerned with generating a really eloquent or brilliant story. All he did was, if I have the comfort, just my own words, like the comfort to sit long enough with the bad writing, eventually some good writing will come out of it. And so it's just that practice of sitting there and just let it rip. And eventually, like, okay, you start panning that, and then there are a few gold nuggets in there. So it's kind of like that. Like, he just had that sort of almost athlete mentality of just going back to the batting tee and just hitting ball after ball after ball.
Yeah, that's right. Philip Roth, I remember reading, would say that he'd finish a book, send the manuscript off to his agent or his publisher or whatever. The next day would wake up, and he was like an 8-hour-a-day, like kind of workman-like attitude about it. And he would get up the next day and start his new book. And he would spend 5 or 6 months, 8 hours a day drafting. And at the end of that period, he would probably have 500 pages of prose, and he would look through it and find maybe like 5 pages out of the 500 that were worth a shit.
Yeah.
And it was from those 5 pages that the next book would be born. But he had to fail through 500 pages, just finding his way into what he finally decided what his next project would be, and then writing it and probably drafting it a bunch of times, So that should be heartening and instructive for somebody like me. And it's something I should do a better job of remembering.
The book too, and I was walking my dogs briefly this morning, and I was just trying to think of, I was just bouncing your book around in my head, and I was thinking of, what came to mind was, life is messy, and living a creative life is messy. And I wonder if that was on the forefront of your mind of like showing that a creative life and life in general is just, it's a sloppy mess that we're all just kind of flopping our way through.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I keep saying this, but I'll repeat myself because it's important to me. And that is that I'm very concerned as a kind of creative project with rendering my confusion on the page and the messiness of life on the page, and not making any kind of like fictive version of myself cooler than he should be. I see this too much in the reading that I do, where a narrator will just be too cool for me. And I really am sensitive to it, where I'm like, this isn't, I can feel the author like hedging, or I can feel the author, making choices that make them seem super cool. And sometimes it's like really pleasant actually as a reader. I'm not even totally sure if it's the right way to go, the way that I'm taking, like maybe readers would prefer to have somebody who's cool guiding them through a cool world or something, but it's just not my experience of life, and it's just my particular preferences. But I like the idea of rendering characters and a world in my books that squares with my experience of lived reality and creative exasperation and spiritual confusion and all the surprises, good and bad, that life can throw at us.
Oh, this episode is brought to you by Athletic Greens. Listen, you've probably heard of these guys, and I have yet to try this product, but what I dig about them is that they're plant-based, which is important to me. Otherwise, this would be a non-starter. With one delicious scoop, you get 75. Wow, that's a lot. Right, Hank? 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, whole food, sourced superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens to help you start your day right. This special blend of ingredients supports gut health, nervous system, immune system, energy, recovery, focus, and aging. All the things. I'm excited to dig into this stuff because it's vegan. But if you're one of those keto bros, It's compliant and all that stuff, like paleo too. It also supports better sleep quality and recovery. So if you're an early riser, you can wake up fresher and ready to tackle your work or your workouts, whatever you want to do. I don't know. What else is pretty rad is in 2020, Athletic Greens purchased carbon credits that support projects protecting old growth rainforests. If you want to experience Athletic Greens to make it easy, Athletic Greens is going to give you a free 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. All you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/emerging. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/emerging to take ownership over your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. Yeah, there's like a moment too where, you just row or the, you write that, there's, another meaningless creative implosion, another stupid turd down the drain. I was like, yeah, creative implosions. I get that all the time. And there was another moment too where you write, or the narrator writes, like, here I was, nearly 40 years old, older than Bob Marley when his light had gone out, a husband and a father and a man of many jobs, a writer in the throes of enormous frustration. I was just like, yeah, that just speaks to it. Heading headlong into middle age, just so creatively frustrated. You're spending the last 20 years trying to get some sort of traction in this world, and you're just still spinning your tires. Like I just felt the enormity of that frustration through passages like that.
Yeah, well, I think another thing that doesn't get talked about enough because it's very painful is just how difficult it is for creative people to get any traction in this world. I mean, it's a very difficult field, and gold floats, right? Like most all of the spoils are reserved for the people who have somehow found a way to get to the very top of the mountain. And sometimes that's through merit. Sometimes it's through luck. Usually, I guess it's through some combination. Maybe it's nepotism, which I guess is a form of luck. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways that it happens. And for the vast majority, and I speak especially of writers, of whom I know so many, despite enormous labor, like dedicated labor over many years, and despite producing masterpieces, just wonderful works of art that have everything in them that a human being could possibly want from a work of art. You know what I'm saying? Like, we've all had this experience when we read a great book and realize that like none of our friends have even heard of it or whatever. It just makes you want to start a podcast. It's a deep frustration for me. And so I have particular like empathy and sympathy for everyone who's in that boat and who's struggling and working hard, because I don't think it's fair. It's not like I bristle a lot when people are like, there's no such thing as luck. I bristle a lot when it's like people get what they deserve. I'm like, no, they don't. Mm-hmm. And no, there isn't. I think that luck definitely plays a role. I mean, you have to be ready for it when it comes. You have to be doing the work, obviously, but it's a fickle world, and most people involved in it are sort of destined to struggle. And I think that it's pretty valiant when you consider that how many people continue to like fight that fight and make the art that so many of us, not just writers, but all of us really in the end need. So I don't know. That's my tribe. I have so much love for writers and artists and people who are involved in that challenge.
Yeah, you have to be, equal parts, committed to the craft, but also like just delusional. Also, like to keep going to war with this world, with the work you want to bring, and you have to love it so much that you would do it when no one's reading. And the fact is, for the vast majority of us, very few people are ever going to read the things that we so painfully labor over. So you just kind of almost have that, just a delusional mindset and a love of the work, because otherwise, if you think too hard outside of those boundaries, there's no way you'd get anything done.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not entirely opposed to the idea that writing and the impulse to write is a kind of mental illness. I think there's some truth to that. I think that, or maybe it's just the way we process, the world and our interior lives. and it's just the only way we know how to do it. I've heard people refer to it as a calling before, which can seem kind of precious, but I sort of understand it on that level too. It just feels like you're wired for this, you know, and if you are, there's no hope for you. Like you can't really quit doing it, even if you want to, or even if like the straight world is sort of telling you to, you know what I'm saying? Like the world is saying, hey, there's no room for you at the inn, and you need to take this kind of job and do this kind of thing. And it's not that simple for somebody who is into books and writing, in my experience.
I know that if I gave up, whether it be the podcast or my delusions to just get some sort of a toehold with my writing, I don't know if I could go back to reading books the same way or listening to podcasts the same way, because I would just be this is just my nature. I would get very bitter. I'm like, God, fuck this person. Yeah, they stuck with it. They did it, but I didn't have it, and I can't do it. And I'll be comparing myself to them, and I gave up. And it's almost like I just have to I got to stay on this treadmill and maybe change the speed, change the incline somewhat, but I have to stay on it. Otherwise, it would just totally pollute my relationship to work. And that's my own issues, but I don't know if that's maybe something you've ever thought about.
I mean, I guess, yeah. I've never come truly close to just completely bailing on it. I think I've sort of surrendered to the idea that this is who I am at this point.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I'm going to try to be better about in the back half of my existence, now that I'm in my mid 40s, you know, is that I'm really going to try to make books more often, as much as I can. I mean, I say this and life can always intervene, just the necessities of breadwinning and, just whatever comes your way, whatever it might be, can sometimes intrude on these sorts of plans. But I think that the best approach, and I've learned this from a lot of guests on my show, is to just keep doing the work and to try to find as much joy in it as possible and as much meaning in it as possible. Write the books that you want to write. Nobody can predict when something's going to land commercially. It's an absolute crapshoot. Yeah. If it doesn't land commercially, it is not definitive in terms of the work's value at all. And really just the act of making art is good for the soul. You know, it's good for people to do this kind of thing and to have this kind of exercise for themselves. So if it's just at that level, it's worth continuing as a kind of almost like personal hygiene.
Yeah.
And so that's going to be hopefully what I do.
Oh, for sure. And with the podcast too, I know when I started, I think very much seduced by, process, maybe prescriptive stuff that I've certainly gotten away from, because I just think one person's prescription for this, it doesn't fit. Sometimes it's interesting to listen to, but I think sometimes we often look for something prescriptive, thinking that that's going to be the skeleton key that's going to unlock something for us. And I wonder how you've over the time of your show that you started in 2011 is how you navigate, talking about the work at hand and also a writer's process, but without also being too prescriptive, and that you're just having one of those sort of conscious bridging conversations, as you've told me in the past.
And it makes me think of graduate school and going into an MFA program, and how I noticed that some students seemed to be more oriented towards the program, like they were there to learn how to be a writer. Mm-hmm. And then there were people who came in, and I hope I don't mean to sound like I'm tooting my own horn. It just mean to say this is how it was. I was working on a book when I got into graduate school and had been kind of daily writing, and I just wanted a place to hide, to keep going. I needed a place to avoid the world, essentially. And I think because of the fact that I was doing the work, the program actually worked for me better. And I was less disappointed with it in some respects than maybe somebody who was hoping that they would come in and get the answers, like you say.
Yeah.
Now, I say that to make, probably making myself look pretty good. But then there have been many stretches of time over the course of my podcast, which has been going on for more than a decade now, where I've sort of like lost the thread and not, I haven't been writing as much as I should. And I've been really doing a lot of work on the show and listening to these other writers who have been doing their writing and sort of gleaning all this wisdom from them that I then wasn't applying. So it's not that you can't get creative breakthroughs from listening to a podcast. You absolutely can, but they can only really manifest for you if you're also doing the work. Mm-hmm. And you're likely to find them to be most materially beneficial to you if you're, dedicated to a daily writing practice and getting up, rain or shine, and doing that work. And then on the side, maybe listening to a podcast or something when you're taking a break. Then I think you are most likely to derive great benefit from it and hear something that triggers something. And then the next morning, you know how to fix the chapter that you were struggling with or something. Yeah. But if you're just sitting there collecting prescriptions, if you're anything like me, you'll forget them, and then you'll need to be reminded again in a month or whatever. So I think the moral of the story is just keep writing, keep doing your work, keep showing up to work. And if you do that in good faith with concentration and dedication, then you're most likely to have some results that you're happy about.
In what way has doing the podcast really helped you as a writer and find your own, hone your voice?
That's a really good question. And it's one of these things that I feel, my relationship to the podcast and what it's taught me is kind of like an in the aggregate thing. But when I have been asked in the past to talk about the things that I've learned from the show, I've tried to keep it simple. The things that I notice in writers who tend to be happiest with the work and with themselves and who tend to be most prolific and productive, they tend to write every day or close to it or on a regular schedule that they do not deviate from. B, they read a ton. Mm-hmm. And C, they don't seem to care as much about making money from it as other writers do. Maybe they're independently wealthy. I don't know. Oftentimes that's the case. That's another unspoken truth about literature and publishing is that there's all these people who are subsidized, in it and don't need the money, which is exactly why they can do it, but those are three things. And, it's not that they don't want to make a living. It's just that like the fame part of it and the cashing in is not nearly as important to them as like doing good work and finding meaning in the work itself and just enjoying writing and books and just being a real nerd about it, like, unapologetically.
Yeah.
So maybe those three things to try to boil it down, as simply as possible are probably the three things that I've learned. And, it's borne fruit. I wrote pretty much every day when I was finishing this book. I've been reading a lot, like more than I ever have in my life, as a result of the show, inspired by my guests. And, I think the continued presence of the show and me continuing to interview people is just a great way for me to continue to get regular reminders, which I need.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about how you fold reading into your day. Given the volume of books you read, that which you post on your website, and I think you've read to date at least what's on the website, like up to 18 books so far. And I've read 12 this year. I keep a track in a bullet journal, and as given the amount of reading you have to do, the producing of the show, your own writing, how are you folding the reading into the day so it doesn't get too, overwhelming?
It's hard. And I don't mean to play a violin for myself, but like doing literary media, I want to give a shout out to people doing literary media and interviewing. If you're preparing to have a guest on and reading their entire book and scouring the internet and reading interviews that they've done previously and listening to interviews that they've done previously and putting together a prep document for that show, the prep alone can sometimes take 10 hours, 12 hours, 15, 20 hours, depending on how long the book is. And then you conduct the interview, which is pretty much the easiest part because it's a concentrated amount of time. And then you have to do all the post-production, and then you have to do all the social media posting, the staging of the show online, the newsletter, all the stuff that goes into putting one of these things out there. Like, it's a lot of work. And, when it comes to reading, it's often a joy. There's nothing better than when I'm really just personally into the book. It's not always the case to, like, there are greater and lesser degrees, of my response to a book. It's totally natural. Not every book is going to speak to you perfectly well, But when when you just happen to catch one that hits you right, it's great, because then it's kind of a joy and you're flying through it. But what I find is that I've become pretty good at reading quickly out of necessity, and it's not that awesome.
Mm-hmm.
I miss a lot. I don't remember things I should probably remember, but I do a weekly show.
Yeah.
And have done since the beginning. I used to do 2 a week. Then I had kids. So, you have to cut back. Sometimes I still do 2, but it's a big challenge. And I love the reading, though. I think it edifies me, and it keeps me writing, and it keeps me in the game. And I learn so much from what people do and don't do on the page. And I think just as like a principle, I want to be a person who reads a lot of books.
Yeah.
I already spend too much time dicking around on the internet. So by keeping a list of what I've read, the books that I've read, it helps to keep me honest on that front. And I just find pockets of time to read. And oftentimes I'm like pseudo speed reading.
Right. And, going back all the way to the start of the show and then just sticking with it for as long as you did, at what point did you realize you're like, I'm pretty good at this. There are some growing pains here, but then eventually you're like, oh, I'm developing a real muscle for this. It doesn't come natural to a lot of people. I wonder for you, like what you've noticed in terms of your development as a host and an interviewer.
Well, I say this in the book, I don't think it's that hard. And I don't mean to self-denigrate. I just think that, like, I have this theory of the case with media jobs. Like, there are some high-profile media jobs that traditionally have been thought of as fancy in the past, and, especially at the upper echelon, pay really well. And really, they're not that hard.
Mm-hmm.
And being a host of a radio show as an interviewer is, in the grand scheme of things, not that hard. Like brain surgery, hard. Yeah. Like chemical engineering, hard. Asking somebody questions sitting across from them on a microphone is not that hard. And I know that there are some people for whom it would be, who are just not wired for it. I get that. But there's a reason why there's 1 million podcasts now. And there are 1 million new people who have declared themselves interviewers. It's because they're curious people who have some facility with language, who can afford a couple of microphones and want to have a show. And I think it's because it's easy. And now the barrier to entry is low. I think that television writing, by contrast, is really easy, but the barrier to entry is super high. And there's this it's like a walled garden, and if you can get in there, it's the reason it's a walled garden is because there's actual money.
You're right.
You can get paid a lot of money. There's a union medical care, or medical insurance. But having written for television and having struggled for a decade to write a book, I can tell you right now that writing a book is way harder than writing an episode of television. Writing like a series, like an entire series, like Breaking Bad over 5 seasons and executing that well consistently season to season, super hard. But I don't mean to like piss on TV writing. I'm just saying that look, hosting a podcast and writing television, in my particular opinion, are not that hard. I think that's why maybe people gravitate to these things, though. The difference, of course, is that podcasters make very little money and TV writers get paid a fortune by comparison.
Yeah, there is a skill element to knowing how to ask questions and not answer the question for the guest. Great pet peeve of mine for interviewers who will ask a question, then answer it, then ask maybe the same question, or they're asking a completely different question because they start chasing their own tail, and they talk for too long, and they like to hear themselves talk, and I'm proving my point right here. But
anybody who talks on a microphone has to probably have something of that to them.
Yeah. And someone you and I have both spoken with, Debbie Millman. She's a wonderful interviewer. She has what I think is like a great shot clock. She tends to get in and out of the question really quickly. and something I'm particularly sensitive to. For you, are there any peeves that you've come across in the interview sphere and things you're like, okay, I'm going to try to get better at this?
Yeah, you just said one. Like, I ramble too much in my questions sometimes. Sometimes I'm fumbling toward the question, just as in the flow of conversation. I just talk too much. Or sometimes I'll be in an interview and I'll be too caffeinated. This has happened a lot through the years where I'm truly just geeked out, or I'm like high energy, and I listen to the playback and I'm like, ugh, like too much, dude. Like, take it down a notch. And so, yeah, I think there's, you don't want to answer the guest's question. You want to give them space. You want to leave that beat of silence to see if they're going to rejoin and say anything additional that could be useful or insightful. But really, to me, it's very intuitive. And I should also say, like, we had a radio station at my high school when I was a kid, and I was a DJ on that radio show, and I took that class. I really idolized. I was in Indiana in the 80s, and like Bob and Tom were the morning show guys, and they were sort of considered at the time irreverent. And my friends and I all thought they were so funny. And I've listened to a lot of Howard Stern through the years, and used to fall asleep at night listening to Terry Gross interviews for a long time. I love interviews.
Yeah.
When I was learning how to be a writer, I would listen to interviews, watch interviews on YouTube, print out an interview every morning and read it. So I say all of this, and then, was doing all of these things, and then came to the point where I was hosting a show. And surely I had given myself some kind of education in it by virtue of consumption and just enthusiasm. And I have, I guess, some facility for it. I think what in the early days, to answer your question, made me feel like I could keep going, or I that it was working, was just that I was getting good feedback right away, from people listening. And I think timing had something to do with it, because when I started my show, there were not nearly so many shows, especially in the literary sphere, that were doing the kind of things that I was doing. It's a little bit more irreverent, I think, like not terribly so, but it was just a little bit looser, I think, than shows on terrestrial radio that might have something to do with books, which can be pretty straight down the line.
And pretentious too.
Sometimes. Sometimes. And I think I was working against that a little bit, just wanting to like have a looser conversation. I was also reacting pretty strongly to my distaste for social media and just this two-dimensional feeling I had for people whenever I was looking at them, as presented on those platforms, and truly just being frustrated. And I was grieving the loss of a friend, and was like, okay, let me just try to get to know people. I'm tired of all this bullshit.
Yeah.
It was like that kind of thing. And it really was pretty simple and unrefined in its earliest days. It was really like, well, who are you? What's going on? Like, I know you're on my computer, but who are you? Like, that was it. And I think over the years, it's changed and evolved and has gotten, like, I think hopefully more professional without losing its essence. Let's put it that way.
Right. And I believe when, back a couple months ago when we were talking for that Writer's Digest piece, you said like when a conversation's really going, you really feel like there's almost a bridging of consciousnesses as you're feeling each other out, getting beyond that husk of social media. So when a conversation is really humming for you, like if you can put a finger on the pulse of it, what would you identify as why that conversation is really working versus others that might not be?
Candor is the most important thing. Vulnerability. When a guest of mine is really speaking from the heart and is willing to risk a little bit and share of themselves, it's going to naturally be a better conversation. Some of it, I think, is biochemical. Sometimes you just hit it off with people. Yeah. And you know what? I think that maybe there's an ability that a host might have that other people don't have as readily, is the ability to sort of find rapport with all kinds of different people. Not like bad 100%, but like most people can have, I can have a conversation with most people and sort of meet them where they are. It's not always, to greater and lesser degrees of success, but I think some people you just hit it off with and it's not entirely clear why. So those are the big things, somebody who comes to the show ready to talk,
yeah,
and not super concerned about, being too revealing or whatever. Not that you need to share every dirty secret from your past or something, but just that you need to be real. And I think sometimes people who are less comfortable with media or just less comfortable with talking to people, especially those they don't know, it's just a bit more challenging and the outcomes are not as good for the listener.
Yeah. Yeah. I always say it's like when someone comes to play ball, and it's just like, I can tell you're coming to play ball, you're coming here just very giving of yourself and your insights of this book and your show. And it's a joy for me on this end of the conversation to know that, even if I don't technically ask a question, you're still going to run with it. And some people don't do that. They'll just be like, yeah. And I'm like, oh boy, this is going to be a tough one.
Yeah. I mean, some are hard.
Yeah.
I've had a couple in my 770 episodes now that I've had to trash. Just one or two, but sometimes like there have been times where I'm like, I can't play this. This didn't work, and it's very rare and probably had more to do with me that day than my guest, just having an off day or being overtired or something. But it is something that actually, if podcasting as a medium might be helping people with in some weird way, it might be helping people learn how to talk. Like maybe listening to all these interview shows, especially when they're going well, or they're produced well and the conversations tend to be interesting and smart and in depth. I think by listening to those shows, you get better at being a guest, or you get better at talking. You go, oh, this is what, you just sort of intuitively pick it up. Like this is like, you can just ask somebody what's going on with them.
Yeah.
I've had somebody say that to me in response to listening to my show. Like she was like, I didn't realize, or, while I was listening to your show, I realized that like, if you are curious about something about somebody, you can just ask them. And so maybe that is one of the benefits of podcasting over the past decade and change, is that, the people who choose to listen to a lot of them, especially like in the interview format, might pick up ways to be better at conversation, which I would argue is really good for people. Like, I think conversation is really edifying and nourishing for people. And it's something we don't do enough of, especially at a level of depth. And I think that is why podcasts are so popular too, is people get this sort of passive experience of having an in-depth conversation. And, when these voices are kind of echoing in your head because you're wearing your earbuds or whatever, it is very intimate.
Yeah.
And it does feel like a bridging of consciousnesses at its very best, when you're just locked into a conversation and it is so speaking to you and it's so interesting and moving. That's the best, that's why I listen to them. And, there's nothing better than that, than finding a conversation that is really resonant and funny, or, some kind of, it elicits some kind of really strong emotional response. And, it's fun to think that people might be benefiting from it and finding ways to sort of connect in their day-to-day lives as a result.
Yeah, and speaking of depth, whether it's in conversations of this nature or certainly what you write about in your book, which is just to me it's so raw in so many places. Just how have you over time cultivated a sense of, this is uncomfortable. I know it's uncomfortable. This is actually where I need to plunge, whether that's as a writer or in the interview too, when you're sensing that someone's holding something back. You're like, actually, this is where I need to lean in a little more.
Well, I'll do it in pieces. I think as a writer, learning to kind of slow down where it hurts is, again, trial and error. It's very easy to trick yourself into avoiding these things on the page, or just kind of moving too quickly, thinking, I don't want to be a drag, or like, it's kind of counterintuitive. We talked about wanting to be a good host and wanting to consider the reader and all this stuff. And, I think it's correct. You don't want to overdo it and keep beating somebody over the head with what is essentially the same difficult life experience or whatever. You do have to have a sense of economy, but, that sense of economy can also be applied to giving the reader a close and careful look at the most dramatic and difficult parts of the story. Of course, you don't want to skimp over that stuff. and I don't know why I can be so hard-headed about it. It's, it's emotional stuff. It's my own discomfort rather than the reader's discomfort that I'm primarily concerned with, which is the problem, but the reader, as a reader, man, like we lean in on those parts, and they're not as disturbing to us as they might be for the person who lived through them or who's calling upon some version of this stuff. It's blended into a fiction, So again, it's about keeping the reader's interests at the forefront and making sure that you're aware of where the heart of the matter is in your narrative and spending extra time there. Maybe not like a million pages, but making sure that you don't look away out of convenience or emotional reflex. And then when it comes to podcasting, I think that the leaning in thing applies as well, maybe to a bit of a lesser extent. Like I think that my attitude as a host is always to make sure that I'm in service of the listener first. I am not there to aggrandize or showcase the author in a primary way. Like sometimes that stuff happens incidentally. And yes, I definitely want to shine a light on the author and, help move book culture a bit back toward the center of the conversation. But ultimately, what I'm trying to do is create this proxy experience for the listener at home. If there's no audience, what's the point?
Yeah.
I guess I could get something out of having the conversation, just mano a mano, but I'm making a show for an audience and I want to make sure that I serve that audience. And so I think I'm always trying to intuit what the audience is thinking while they're listening in the moment. And I'm trying to anticipate that and serve as their surrogate and ask the questions that they themselves might be asking as they drive in their car or sit on the subway or whatever. And sometimes that can require me to be blunt. I might have to just be like, well, wait a minute, tell me more about the cancer treatment or whatever. Like I didn't get, what kind of cancer was it? Like some clarity is usually what I'm asking for more than anything else. And then maybe the person goes deeper or they opt not to. There's that side of it, the sort of fidelity to the listener. And then there also should be, I think, consideration for the guest and whatever it is that they're talking about. And, you don't want to overdo it when you're pressing someone.
Yeah.
Like what I always tell guests when they ask me, like a lot of times before a show, a guest will be like, how do I do this? Like what will make it a good interview? And I always say, be candid. Be candid, but being candid does not mean you have to tell me every last thing. It could mean that you tell me, you know what, and I'm really not going to say anymore because I'm not feeling like it's my business to make it public or it's just too hard. That's candor too, and I think listeners, as long as they know that you're giving them that, they're on board. It's when they feel like you're sort of hedging or presenting yourself, in a way that's inauthentic or trying to be cool, or you're just not there to play ball, as you said. That's when they switch over to something else. They turn the show off or go outside or whatever.
Yeah. And having done this show for the better part of 10 years, sometimes I don't necessarily know what the audience of the show wants. Like, do they want those routine things? Do they want more prescriptive things that I kind of find off-putting? How do you know what your audience wants?
That's a good question. It's one of those things I should probably be better at. Like I should make little like surveys or something.
I think about that too. Like, I've asked some people, what would you want to hear more of? Some people who are routinely in touch with the show, there's very few who do, but it is one of those things where like, should I follow my own taste or should I really be like, okay, they want to know this. So, I want to deliver for the people who are going to spend an hour with me every week.
Yeah, I mean, okay, this is where the cynic in me might come out. I think if you look at podcast rankings and what shows are really dominant, and a lot of it is tied to celebrity, and just having a lot of people know who you are to begin with. But a lot of times, when you look at the numbers and you look at the shows and the formats that they're operating in, the shows are about, in some way or another, how to improve yourself. It's how to get an edge professionally. It's how to improve your body and your mind or your mind. It's how to invest in crypto. It's all about how to make money, really, isn't it? Like it's basically about how to get rich and skinny and hot.
Yeah.
And those kinds of shows and the people who host them and position themselves in the culture as kind of gurus or whatever, they tend to do well. And man, there is a cynic in me that's like, fuck that. I don't like that. Something about it rubs me the wrong way. And maybe it's just like my own insecurities. Like the success and failure culture that we live in, and the hyper capitalist and, end of capitalism, however you want to characterize it, like world that we live in, the value systems feel all wrong to me. And I think that what I've experienced, because at the same time, like I'm just like anybody. Somebody will be like, hey, this is what you should be eating if you want to live to be 120. I'll be like, okay, give it to me. Or, if you invest this way, the compound interest over time means that you will, reach the age of 70 and you'll be wealthy enough to not have to work anymore or whatever. And you'll be like, okay, like I'm as susceptible to this stuff as anybody. But what I find is that when I finish listening to one of those shows, I'm anxious. And when I finish listening to a show where like Terry Gross is interviewing a comedian, or, I listen to whatever it might be, that's not that, that's not prescriptive or kind of capitalist at its core, or built on this kind of idea of constant self-improvement. I feel nourished. And so I think there's got to be something to it for me anyway. Like maybe I just can't take it, but it just seems like there's a lot of money to be made out of that anxiety. There's a lot of audience that you can draw when you play on people's fears and feelings of inadequacy. And what I'm doing in my show is talking to authors because I'm genuinely enthusiastic about books and what they can do for people and what they can do for an entire society, if they're valued properly and available, to people. And I accept that means that I will have a smaller audience. And I probably also don't I hustle pretty hard. I feel like I'm doing a lot. I know what I do in a day for my show, but I don't think I'm necessarily the greatest self-marketer and the most fanatically, competitive.
Yeah.
I don't care. I don't care about analytics that much. I don't sit around hand-wringing about that. I like doing my show. I know there are thousands of people every week who like it. That's enough for me. I mean, my show's been downloaded since it began millions and millions of times.
It's amazing.
That seems crazy to me, like for a little book show like mine. And, I say that, and then I look at I'll look at a podcast chart on some internet story, and it'll be like, oh, well, that dude who's a celebrity, like he gets that amount of podcasters every week,
right?
Or whatever, or, listeners every week. So, I don't want to overstate the grandeur of my success, but I understand the niche that I'm in. I understand the role that books play in American society in 2022. I'm content to fight this fight and to keep having these conversations because I know they're meaningful, not just to me, but to the people who listen, because I hear from listeners, and that is enough for me.
There's a moment in the book. Actually, let me preface it by saying, a few years ago, January 4th, 2017, when we had to put our first dog to sleep, it was the most gut-wrenching experience of my life. It was terrible, just weeping, sobbing, just ugly cry. It was terrible. And, when they took Jackie out of the room and kind of whisked him away, and then my wife and I were just there, and then we just kind of hugged each other, and I out of the blue, I just told her how much I loved her. And it just, to me, it struck me as kind of a weird thing to say at that moment. And I sort of intellectualized it in a sense that now the love for my dog who just died, it just kind of had nothing to glom onto. And so I say this because there's a moment in the book too where you had to put the character had to put a dog to sleep. And that was the moment where the narrator says that he loved his girlfriend or wife girlfriend for the first time, and it just connected with me on such a visceral level because in that moment of raw grief, it was just you need to throw your love onto something.
Yeah, well, this is why I often say that some of my favorite moments in life have happened at funerals, or I've often felt my best in a weird way at funerals, like despite being grief stricken and out of sorts and, you know, all the rest, because defenses are down and priorities are in order. There's a clarity to people. The bullshit falls away. Nobody's listening to a podcast about like stoicism and the paleo diet,
biohacking,
you know, at grandpa's funeral. Or yeah. You know what I'm saying? Like none of that shit is even anywhere on the radar. And so suddenly, you know, it's like the veil drops and you see things clearly and you blurt things out. And that felt like emotionally true to me. You know, you're in the presence of death and you suddenly, you know, don't have the same reservations that you had a day or two before. Yeah,
I found there were just moments like that throughout the entire book, and rarely does a book. It's just the nature of reading. I think rarely do books that kind of make me like my eyes burn or tear up, and this book did it on a couple occasions. There was one moment where, like, you know, the little boy comes up to, you know, your disabled son and actually like looks up to you and your wife in the book. And he was just like, this must be so hard for you. This little boy saying this to you. And then you looked over at Franny, the wife here, and she's just crying behind her sunglasses. And I was just like, that moment just was so simply written and it was so poignant. And it was like, I couldn't believe like just what you were pulling off, like the weight those words were carrying in that moment. It was great stuff.
Well, thank you. And that's something that actually is drawn from real life. And, you know, like anybody who's a parent, you know, it's like one of these fundraisers for school supplies, you know, on a Saturday where there's like a jogathon. So you're already bitter that like you have to go raise money so that your kids can have pencils in their school or whatever. And then on top of it, it's a Saturday and it's Saturday morning and you got to load the kids up. And then, you know, you have a disabled child and you know from past experience that when you go out, you're sort of going to be on display and everybody's going to be stealing glances at you and like whispering about what's going on. And then you have to deal with the emotional strain of watching all of these other kids, many of whom are the same age as your disabled child. And they are typical and running around and laughing. And your kid is in a walker and can barely take a step, and you're at a jogathon. So the kids are jogging and you're like slow walking with, you know, it's like, it's just a recipe, you know, it's just a recipe and it's hot, you know, and all this stuff. And yeah, there was a child, much as it is rendered in the book. And I wish I knew who this child was now. I would like send his parents a nice note, but he stopped. A child stopped. Everybody else walked by. Nobody really, you know, people just stay away. You know, they get freaked out or whatever. And you learn that. It's pretty isolating when you're the parent of a disabled child in a lot of ways. And this kid was just like panting. He was jogging, just stopped and said, "Good morning," introduced himself, gave my son a high five, and then just looked at my wife and just goes like, "I know it must be so hard." And both of us were just like, yep. You know, like, and it was just extraordinary. It was extraordinary emotional intelligence that this child demonstrated and compassion, you know, just, it was a big lesson for me in what to say to somebody, you know, because I struggle too, you know. This is the thing, is that it can be very easy to get judgmental when you're the one who's sort of, you know, getting, like when you're in the crucible, you know, when you're in the emotional crucible, it's easy to kind of get bitter and be like, these fuckers don't even realize, and they're being, you know, quit looking at me, quit asking me what went wrong. That's another thing you should never say to a parent of a disabled child. Nothing went fucking wrong. He's fine. You know, he's just disabled. But people do that. Like, what went wrong with your son? And it's like, hey, you know, like I've had friends of mine say the R word to my face. I've had friends of mine make short bus jokes. They're making a joke. And if I'm being honest, I've made insensitive jokes. I don't know. I'm pretty, like I said earlier, I have the sense of humor of a 12-year-old boy, and I am extremely permissive when it comes to humor, especially when I know that it wasn't intended to harm. You know, it almost never is. It's intended to make people laugh. And if it doesn't land or it's in poor taste, like, I can forgive this. And then on an even deeper level, I just think that, like, as much as I can be bitter sometimes, or as much as I can wince when somebody drops the R word, just in a conversation, not about a person who is disabled, but maybe just about like a situation, the way that we use it as a pejorative applied generally. Yeah. I might wince, but I try to have some humility about my own blind spots. And I also don't think that it solves anything if you just, attack the person or make them feel shitty. I try to immediately forgive, as long as I know it was not done with intent to harm. If you come with intent to harm or you're being a dick, then you're dead. I will go ape shit. But I think that at my best, I am trying to, stay open-hearted about it. And I think it's just more effective in the long run at getting people to come around to like not using the R word as a pejorative, because it does hurt people. Yeah. Even if they don't mean to, or not, and you learn things like this little boy taught me, you don't say what went wrong. You say, man, I know it must be hard. That's all you got to say. People just want to be seen, and I think we were just in that morning with that particular combination of experiences. We were both just sort of gritting our teeth and hiding behind our sunglasses and trying to make the best of it. And it just, when he said that, it was just like this release.
Yeah. My God. Well, Brad, I want to be mindful of your time, and there's always one question I like to end these podcasts on, is by asking the guest for a recommendation of some kind for the listeners. I don't know if you caught my email this morning. Okay, wonderful. So yeah, that's always something I like to ask to bring this airliner down for a landing. If you have a recommendation of sorts for the listeners out there, I'd love to hear it.
Well, I thought about this. I thought about writers in particular. But I mean, I could recommend books, but I feel like most people listening to this, they have books sorted out, right? So I will recommend my favorite caffeinated beverage, which I have evangelized a bit for before on my show. And I just believe so strongly in it, and that is yerba mate. I think that people don't realize how superior it is to coffee. I will die on this hill. It does not give you the kind of like manic energy that coffee does. There is not any kind of come down similar to coffee. It also, yerba mate neutralizes the bacteria that cause bad breath. Oh. So when you drink it, your breath improves, as opposed to coffee, which makes your breath smell like, dung. And then, yeah, I don't know. I've drank plenty of both. I am a devotee of caffeine. It's part of my life, so I cop to it. But yerba mate is a South American rainforest leaf, essentially, plant that grows under the shade canopy of the rainforest. And so, yeah, I brew mine in a French press. I brew it pretty strong. And it's important. I should also add, I think it's important to get unsmoked yerba mate, because they dry the leaves.
Okay.
And if they dry them with smoke, I think there's a good bit of evidence that helps make it carcinogenic, like not terribly, but get unsmoked. I buy a brand called La Oberenia, which you can buy in these great burlap sacks from Amazon. So it's like you're getting a kilo of some illicit substance in the mail. And it's $20 and it lasts you for at least a month, at least. So it saves you money too, because coffee's a ridiculous expense.
Yeah.
Especially from a coffee shop. In Los Angeles, it is literally like $9 for a latte at some of these bespoke, like organic, or whatever you call it, coffee shops. And that's bullshit. Like, come on. Like there's a level of ridiculousness to it. And I get it, because the rents are high and people are just trying to make it. But I think that yerba mate delivers an awesome high. It makes me happy. I guess coffee probably makes people happy too. You get a little bit of elation. But I really believe in it.
Nice.
And so I am going to step down from my soapbox now. But yeah, La Oberenia yerba mate from a French press. If you really want to be authentic about it, you can drink it from a bombilla, which is one of those little gourds with a straw. But I like a French press, pretty strong, 2 cups in the morning, and you're good.
Nice. I like mud water a lot, which is definitely doesn't have the spike of caffeine, but it's pretty expensive. But it's similar in that you don't get the massive high, or so I weaned myself off of the strength of the caffeine and coffee couple months ago. It was a hellish couple days, but once I came off of that, I was like, all right, I'm in a good place now. So yeah, but that sounds awesome. I think a lot of people will dig that.
I've seen these commercials on YouTube for mud water.
Yeah, it's pretty damn good. It's got a lot in common with chai, and it's got 1/7 the caffeine of coffee, and it's pretty mellow. It tastes pretty good. I put a little oat milk and a little bit of brown sugar and maple syrup in it. It's like pretty damn good.
Yeah, I mean, I think people are probably at home like already writing me emails to let me know that coffee's the best, but. You asked for something that I wanted to recommend, and so I'm going to recommend yerba, which I've been drinking since I was like 21. So I'm a lifer.
Very nice. Has anyone told you that you look exactly like Bill Simmons?
No.
Nice. Well, I'm the first one. You look exactly like Bill Simmons.
But I wish I had the empire that Bill Simmons had. That would be nice. I wish I had Bill Simmons' bank account.
No kidding. that sweet Spotify money.
I mean, yeah, that was well-timed, well-played.
No kidding. Well, Brad, thank you so much for coming on the show and coming to talk some shop. And, of course, thanks for the work. This book is incredible. So thanks for the time and thanks for the work.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you reading and taking the time to talk with me. I really enjoyed it.
Wasn't that great? Yeah, that was a lot of fun. I like that. Thanks to Brad for coming on the show and for being an intrepid source for my Writer's Digest piece called The Writer's Guide to Being a Great Podcast Guest. He had some great insights in there. WritersDigest.com. Look it up. It's good. It's a good little piece that'll help you if you're going to be on podcasts. Brad is at OtherPPL on Twitter and Instagram. That's the Other People podcast. He's been doing it since 2011. Amazing. More than 700 episodes, nearly 800. I've been doing my thing since 2013. His pod's been downloaded more than 1 million times. Jeez, that's bonkers. Well deserved, IMO. Right. So, okay, I don't think my boss at the old day job listens to the podcast. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and talk about a job I didn't get at my own paper. I applied to get out of my dead-end career-killing job editing the husk of what used to be the opinion page of the Register Guard newspaper here in Eugene, Oregon. Yeah, I'm mired in letters to the editor and columns and such. It used to be 7 days a week. Now it's 3 days a week. Gannett. Yeah, we're a Gannett property, so if you're familiar with that shithole of a company, you know opinion doesn't matter. God, I was on a call with some of these fucking drones who clearly haven't smiled since the first Nintendo about talking about how opinion doesn't drive anything. Actually, opinion content leads to people canceling their subscriptions. So, this is their weird, perverse way of saying, well, let's just do away with it. They also sandbag opinion content and then say that it's not performing well. It's like, oh, wow. Surprise, surprise, when you don't promote it and it doesn't do well, and you're like, well, this shit's not doing well. I wonder why. Anyway, I applied for this food and entertainment writer job at the paper that I've been at for now 3 years. Right up my alley, a lot of feature writing, and I'm a pretty skilled features writer, as some of you may or may not know, or some of you may or may not agree. I thought I had a great interview. I was excited about the position, and they seemed super concerned, if anything, about me being vegan and covering the food beat, as if they thought I was going to be Guy fucking Fieri or something. I told them I have a friend who reviews alcohol for Bloomberg, and he doesn't drink. He has a surrogate taste the shit, and then he writes about it. The one question that caught me flat-footed, regrettably so, was like, what story ideas do you have already? So I said what I said, but I felt okay because I'm like, whatever. Ideas are a dime a dozen. Geez, you sit down for 30 minutes, you can come up with 100 ideas. And I had a one-on-one with my boss the other day about opinion stuff, and then at the very end, I asked about the status of the food position, given that it's been 2 weeks and I haven't heard a word. She said we're looking for someone with more story ideas and more excitement for the position. I wrote that down in my notebook, and there was an awkward silence for about a good solid 5 seconds, and we're both just nodding along, and then we both said, okay, great, talk to you later. So this was, in my opinion, fucking horseshit, and I was really fucking pissed the other night. Pissed and depressed and kind of wounded. Like, I have institutional knowledge of the city. I didn't ask for too much money. God forbid I earn a living wage. And I got to thinking that maybe I'm just not that good at all. Like, maybe I've been deluding myself this entire time. Now, why wouldn't you hire the bird in hand who's skilled, knows the city, knows the culture? But no. And I was talking with my wife, and she said that maybe I am deluding myself. Maybe I'm not good at all. And she said, maybe you're not supposed to be a writer, which was like a kick in the balls on par with actually being kicked in the balls. For someone who's been hit in the nads with baseballs several times, it's none too pleasant. She said, maybe you're supposed to be an editor. And I have some clients, but when you can't get people to pay, let's say, like $2 for a Patreon, like few people are going to pay you $2,000 to edit a book. And I haven't found it to be sustainable. You get some here and there, but it's really hard to find, I don't know, 5 people a month who want to pay you that kind of money. Writers, you're a writer. You know this. You don't have like $2,000 just kicking around and be like, I want this book that I don't know will be published. BO, come give me a hand. But I didn't say any of that, because when I say that, she gets really pissed at me and says, like, well, that's why you're a failure. Anyway, so it was a pretty lousy day. But then you read that 19 kids were murdered and 2 teachers were murdered at a school, and it puts things in perspectives. And as soon as you deal with all that rage and sadness, and you're like, you end up being like just really happy that you haven't chosen to have kids, so you don't have to dress them in Kevlar so they can learn their ABCs. You realize your stupid little writing career doesn't matter worth a lick. So I'll start really leaning into my freelancing. It's just got to happen. I'm unhireable. So I got to be a freelance free agent, man, and get this NASCAR of a podcast. And by that, I mean the podcast is a car that needs branding on it, so I can make a little more dough, build up the editing base, the writing base, and walk out of this job, middle fingers blazing, and try to live the best life I can with the people and dogs who, on a good day, appear to like me. All the while saying, if you can't do, interview. See ya.